March has arrived, and with it, something shifts in the pressure you have been carrying. February held a significant amount of weight. Starting with the solar eclipse on the 17th, moving through days of emotional aftershock, decision pressure, sudden clarity, and the disorienting early days of Mercury retrograde, February asked a great deal of you. If you are arriving at March 1st feeling like you have been through something, that is accurate. You have been through something. And the temptation at the beginning of a new month is to treat the calendar turn as a reset, to assume that the pressure of the previous weeks is behind you now, that March represents clean ground. It does not. The energy does not reset because the date changes. Mercury is still retrograde in Pisces, and if anything, the threshold of March 1st intensifies what that retrograde has been producing rather than softening it. What was surfacing last week is not finished surfacing. What was pressing toward resolution is still pressing. And now, with a new month beginning, there is a specific psychological weight that gets added to whatever remains unresolved. The sense that carrying something forward into a new period is a choice, and one with its own consequences. Today is a turning point. Not because the astrology announces it dramatically, but because the accumulation of the last 2 weeks has reached a point where continuation of the previous patterns carries real cost, and where the window for certain kinds of clarity and action is beginning to close. What you address consciously now, while the retrograde is surfacing it, is available to you for genuine resolution. What you allow to slip back below the surface will return, likely at a time and in a form that is considerably less convenient. This is the day to pay attention. Mercury retrograde in Pisces has been operating as a specific kind of interference since late February. To understand what is happening today, it is worth being precise about what this retrograde placement actually does to your inner functioning, because it is more subtle and more pervasive than the typical retrograde descriptions suggest. Pisces governs the domain of experience that operates beneath rational thought. Emotional memory, intuition, the residue of past relationships and experiences that lives in the body rather than in conscious recall, the tendency to dissolve the boundaries between what is objectively present and what you are projecting from your own emotional history. Mercury in Pisces, even when direct, has a quality of perceptual softness. Thoughts are more associative than analytical, communication carries more feeling than precision, and the line between what someone said and what you felt they meant gets blurrier. Mercury retrograde in Pisces amplifies all of this while also running it backward through time. The past does not just become present, it becomes emotionally immediate in a way that can be genuinely disorienting if you are not tracking what is happening. What this produces for you specifically, right now, is a mental environment where clarity and confusion alternate unpredictably. You will have moments of genuine sharp perception, moments where something about a situation or a person or a pattern in your own behavior becomes suddenly, unmistakably clear. And then, shortly after that clarity arrives, something will blur it. A doubt will surface. An alternative interpretation will appear. The emotional resonance of the history around the situation will pull your attention away from the current facts and back into older, more layered territory. That cycling between clarity and blur is not a sign that your perception is unreliable. It is Mercury retrograde in Pisces doing exactly what it does. The clarity is real. So is the blur. The work is learning to hold the clear moments without acting impulsively on them, and to hold the blurring moments without letting them talk you out of what you genuinely know. Memory is running at an unusual depth right now. Things that happened months or years ago are surfacing with a vividness that makes the emotional distance feel shorter than it actually is. A conversation you had with someone important to you that ended badly. You may find yourself inside the feeling of that conversation today, not just the memory of it. A decision you made in the past that you have questioned since. It may arrive today with the full weight of that questioning, pressing toward re-examination. A relationship that ended without genuine closure may feel closer today than it has in a long time, not because anything about that situation has changed, but because Mercury retrograde in Pisces dissolves the usual insulation between the past and the present emotional state. This is not pathological. It is the retrograde functioning as a mechanism for surfacing what has not been genuinely resolved, bringing forward the emotional material that is still active, still consuming resources, still shaping your current perceptions and choices in ways you may not be fully aware of. The material surfacing right now is asking for something: completion, acknowledgement, genuine release, honest re-examination. The specific form of what it is asking for varies by person and by situation. The common thread is that the asking is happening now, and the window for responding to it is the retrograde period you are currently inside. Subconscious fears are also more accessible today than usual. The fears that typically operate below the threshold of your direct awareness, about abandonment, about worthlessness, about being fundamentally misunderstood or impossible to love, about failure in the domains that matter most to you. These are closer to the surface under Mercury retrograde in Pisces. This proximity can be disorienting because fears operating at subconscious depth tend to produce behavior and interpretation without announcing themselves as fears. You respond to a message with more defensiveness than the message warranted, and you do not immediately register that the defensiveness was fear rather than reasonable caution. You interpret a silence as confirmation of something you have dreaded, and you do not immediately register that the interpretation was being driven by the fear rather than by the actual evidence. The 1st of March, under these conditions, brings a specific kind of test. The test is whether you can hold the emotional intensity of what is surfacing, the fears, the memories, the unfinished business, the sudden clarity alternating with doubt, without either suppressing it entirely or acting from its most pressured version. Both responses are understandable. Both produce outcomes you will need to manage afterward. The space between suppression and reactive action is where the genuine work of this period lives, and it is worth being specific about what that space looks like practically. Something in your life right now cannot remain in suspension much longer. You probably already know what it is. There is a situation, a relationship, a decision, a conversation that has been forming for weeks without being spoken, a commitment you have been half inside of without fully choosing it, that has been accumulating weight throughout February. Mercury retrograde has been surfacing it. The Cancer moon days amplified its emotional charge. The pressure days of the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th pushed it toward the surface. February 25th and 26th gave you clarity about its actual shape. The last 2 days under direct Mercury retrograde influence have been testing your reading of it, blurring and then resharpening your perception of it. March 1st is the day that situation announces, in its own way, that the suspension period is ending. The announcement may come from inside, a sense of having reached the limit of your ability to hold something unaddressed. Or it may come from outside, a development in the situation, a communication from another party, a circumstance that removes the option of continued inaction. Either way, the situation is pressing for movement, and the specific pressure of today is around the recognition that waiting is now a decision rather than a neutral holding pattern. This distinction matters. When you choose to wait on something, that choice has consequences. The other party in an unresolved situation is also living inside the unresolved state and will eventually respond to it in their own way, which may not be the way you would prefer. The professional or practical situation you have been holding in abeyance is continuing to develop whether or not you make an explicit choice about your direction. The conversation you have been deferring is accumulating weight daily, and each day of deferral makes it slightly harder to begin. Waiting is not neutral. It is an active choice to let circumstances continue on their current trajectory, and on March 1st, inside Mercury retrograde in Pisces, that trajectory is not standing still. The heightened sensitivity you are likely feeling today is worth taking seriously rather than trying to manage away. Sensitivity under Mercury retrograde in Pisces is information dense. The things that move you today, the things that produce unexpected emotional response, the interactions that land more heavily than you anticipated, these are pointing to where your genuine investment is, where your real vulnerabilities are, where the material that has been surfacing this week is connected to something in you that runs deep. Trying to flatten that sensitivity through distraction or self-management misses what it is offering. The sensitivity is a compass. It is showing you what matters and where the work actually is. At the same time, acting from peak sensitivity produces the category of outcomes Mercury retrograde in Pisces is most known for: communications that carry more charge than the situation required, decisions that were made from the most emotionally pressured version of your perception rather than from the clearest version, confrontations that escalated past what the underlying situation warranted because the emotional state behind them was not fully examined before the communication was sent. The goal is not to eliminate the sensitivity. The goal is to hold it long enough that it becomes information rather than immediately becoming action. Midway through March 1st, or wherever you are in this day as you are watching this, something needs your honest attention. There is a question you have been asking yourself without fully allowing yourself to answer it. A situation you have been assessing without fully allowing yourself to conclude. A truth about something in your current life that you have been approaching and retreating from throughout this week, getting closer to it, and then finding a reason to back away before it fully registers. Mercury retrograde in Pisces makes that back and forth feel like genuine uncertainty. Some of it is genuine uncertainty, but some of it is the specific discomfort of a conclusion that, once fully acknowledged, requires something of you, requires you to act, to speak, to let go, to commit, to change something about the way you have been operating. That discomfort is not a sign that the conclusion is wrong. It is a sign that the conclusion is real, and that real conclusions carry weight. Today is the day to sit with that conclusion long enough to let it fully land. Not to act on it immediately. Mercury retrograde in Pisces still distorts the execution of important communications and decisions, and the practical guidance about waiting 48 to 72 hours before irreversible action still applies. But to stop retreating from the knowing, to let yourself know what you know, to acknowledge, internally and explicitly, what the last 2 weeks of surfacing and processing and clarifying have produced in your understanding of your own situation. There is a practical difference between acknowledgement and action, and it is worth holding clearly. Acknowledging what you know does not obligate you to act on it immediately. It does not require a conversation today, or a decision today, or a confrontation today. What it requires is that you stop spending energy on managing your own perception. Stop working to maintain the partial view, the charitable interpretation that has already worn thin, the comfortable ambiguity that is no longer available to be comfortable. Acknowledgement means letting what is true be true in your own awareness, without qualification, without immediately reaching for the explanation that softens it. The action follows from that acknowledgement, in its own time, with better conditions than today provides for execution. The practical guidance for March 1st runs through the same principles that have been relevant throughout this Mercury retrograde window, but with specific emphasis on the threshold quality of today. Pause before reacting to anything that arrives with emotional charge. The pause does not need to be long. 30 minutes is usually sufficient to let the first wave of emotional activation settle enough that you can assess what the incoming communication is actually saying, separate from what it is activating in you. Read messages twice. Check the second read against the first and notice where they diverge. The divergence is often where the projection is, the place where your emotional state is filling in meaning that the actual words do not contain. Observe your emotional impulses rather than immediately executing them. The impulse to reach out to someone from your past, feel it, notice what it is pointing toward, and wait before acting on it. The impulse to send a confrontational message, notice what the confrontation would be trying to achieve, and assess whether today's perceptual conditions are reliable enough to make that achievement likely. The impulse to withdraw completely and wait for everything to resolve on its own. Notice that this impulse is also a response to pressure, and that it carries its own costs. Keep the most irreversible decisions and communications in the 48 to 72-hour holding pattern. This continues to be the single most protective practical guideline for this retrograde period. The decision that feels most urgent today will still be available in 3 days. The clarity that arrives after Mercury retrograde's most intense perceptual distortion has settled will be meaningfully more reliable than the clarity available right now. Permanent decisions made from temporary emotional fog require more repair than the few days of waiting would have cost. Before any significant communication today, any message or conversation that addresses something important and requires the other person to understand you accurately, clarify your own intention first. What do you actually want to achieve through this communication? What outcome would serve the situation genuinely, not just provide emotional release? What is the most essential thing that needs to be said, stripped of the accumulated charge around it? Starting from those questions before you speak or write produces substantially better communication than starting from the emotional state and letting it find words. The subconscious material that is more accessible today, the fears, the old wounds, the patterns you carry from earlier in your history, treat these as information rather than instructions. When a fear arrives that is driving your interpretation of a current situation, name it explicitly in your own awareness. I am reading this as rejection because I have a strong fear of rejection, not only because the evidence clearly supports that interpretation. That naming creates a small but significant space between the fear and the action it was trying to produce. That space is where choice lives. March has started. The energy of this month is not going to be a quiet recovery period from February's intensity. Mercury retrograde in Pisces continues through most of March, and the material that has been surfacing is going to keep pressing for engagement. The difference now, the difference that March 1st represents, is that the initial shock of the retrograde's early influence has passed, and what remains is more specific. The blurring has narrowed to the places in your life where there is genuinely something to address. The emotional charge is running through the situations that actually require your attention, not just through everything indiscriminately. You have had 2 weeks of increasingly specific information about your own inner terrain. The eclipse opened it. The pressure days brought it into feeling. The clarity days made it legible. The retrograde has been testing and retesting it, checking what holds under emotional pressure, surfacing what has not been genuinely resolved, showing you through the quality of your own reactions where the real vulnerabilities and the real investments are. March 1st is the day to take what you have learned from all of that and step into this new month with it, rather than carrying the weight of February's unresolved material as dead weight into what comes next. The carrying is optional. The addressing is what makes it optional. There is something you know that you have been circling for 2 weeks. There is a position you have been holding that has become untenable. There is a conversation or an acknowledgement or a decision that is ready to move. Not because the timing is perfect, because under Mercury retrograde in Pisces the timing is rarely perfect, but because the cost of continued suspension has now exceeded the cost of movement. You feel the turning point today. That feeling is reliable even when the specific form it should take remains somewhat blurred by the retrograde. Let the turning point register. Let the month begin with that registration rather than with continued deferral. The action, when it comes, will be better for being taken from acknowledged ground rather than from the position of continuing to half know something and not acting on the knowing. March has begun. The energy is moving. The situations that need your engagement are not waiting indefinitely. What you bring to them consciously, from the most aware version of yourself, produces different outcomes than what happens when you allow the situation to continue developing without your deliberate participation. You either respond consciously to what this period is surfacing, or the situation moves without your direction. That is not a threat, it is simply the mechanics of how unaddressed situations develop over time. Your conscious engagement with what this period has been offering you is worth more than whatever comfort the deferral has been providing. The month is open. The retrograde is active. The material is surfaced and waiting. What you do with that is yours to decide. And deciding it well, even if not today, is the work March has begun asking of you.